Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Come on into our Wednesday webinar. My name is Reverend Dr. Reginald Nichols. I am the Director of Leadership Development for the California-Nevada Conference of the United Methodist Church. Thank you for joining us for this Western Jurisdiction webinar. Please join us by introducing yourself in the chat window. Let us know who you are, where you're from. We'd certainly appreciate it. Also, during our webinar, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A function below. And as we move through the webinar, if we have time, we'll make sure that we get a chance to answer those questions. All of our webinars and this webinar will be recorded and posted on all of the websites of our conferences in the Western jurisdiction of the United Methodist Church. Today, we have a timely and sobering webinar for you, focusing on how we see others as we are continuing to hear the horrific accounts of violence against our Asian and Asian American sisters and brothers. This webinar today is an initial conversation that we hope will lead to more solidarity, concerted action, and the creation of listening spaces and healing. We are blessed to have Bishop Minerva Carcano, resident bishop of the California-Nevada Conference of the United Methodist Church, with us digitally to share a welcome and words of blessing.
Brothers and sisters, siblings, friends, I greet you in the powerful, peaceful name of Christ our Lord. Christ the shepherd who comes among us, caring for each and every one of us, for each and every one of us is made in the image and likeness of God. We are all beloved of God, and Jesus calls us to be one, to be community, loving community with each other. For the transformation of the world, Jesus calls us to peace, not to hatred, and certainly not to violence. We lament the moment that we find ourselves in of such open hatred and violence, especially at this moment against our Asian American brothers and sisters, families, communities, neighbors, congregations even. Thank you for raising your voices. Thank you for gathering to listen, to grow, to learn together so that we might know how to be a witness, the best kind of witness we can possibly be as people of Christian faith, as followers of Jesus. This webinar is a webinar intended for all of our conferences in the Western jurisdiction, supported by our College of Bishops. We bishops stand together in a posture of wanting to lead all of us to peace and to beloved community, but also to raising our voices and saying violence, hatred against another because of the color of our skin, the sound of our voice, our language, our culture. That kind of hatred and violence is unacceptable. And we need to stand firm in our witness. So it is good to be together on this day across the Western jurisdiction, but we also welcome others who may have chosen to join us. Thank you for being with us, for helping us to learn, for helping us to be people of peace. I'm so very grateful, along with my colleague bishops, for the work of our Congregational Church in this moment on this particular concern. We are particularly grateful for the work of our Asian American Language Ministry Office, led by a member of the West, a member of the California-Nevada Conference, the Reverend John Oda. Brother John, thank you for your leadership. God bless you and strengthen you as you lead us forth with other leaders from across our Congregational Church. We're grateful for our General Commission on Religion and Race and our agencies, the Board of Church and Society, discipleship ministries, global ministries, and others who are providing us incredible resources for this very moment. I commend their resources to all of you. In the California Nevada Conference, I want to inform you that we are working hard on finding ways to help our conference dismantle its own institutional racism. We have invited Aaron Hawkins Smith to join us as a consultant in our efforts, but also to help us connect what we do in our conference with the worldwide efforts to dismantle racism, tribalism, everything that we do that separates us from one another around the world in our worldwide church. She is a consultant to our Council of Bishops, as our Council of Bishops stands in that place of wanting to lead our church to be anti-racist. And so we hope that she'll help us be even more deeply connected with our efforts, particularly in the context of our ministry in the West and in the United States. The racism that we're dealing with is in the context of this country. It is a particular racism with a long history, part of our DNA. It requires our attention in this context, not speaking to others in other parts of the world about their struggles on the issue of race and differences. It's about speaking to ourselves about our sin of racism. Our core team in this annual conference is also working diligently to find ways to listen in this moment to our Asian American congregations and communities, to see what we need to be doing to be a strong partner, to be a partner in community organizing for the changes that need to happen. Because the violence we see is historic, institutional, it's political. It is embedded in the way that we treat our racial ethnic communities in this country and in the cities, towns in our annual conference. So they're helping us think through those aspects of this work as well. And we are a community of faith. And so I would call us all to remember to pray. You may remember the statement that I sent forth on Saturday, inviting us to pray every time we can in worship as we arise, as we end our day, as we have a moment to take a breath and take it all in, to keep on praying. As we meet for business, let us pray. And let us not forget to invite our children to join us, that they may become a powerful voice in our world, a voice of prayer and a voice for peace. Finally, I want to invite you to join us in a service of lament and healing. It'll be celebrated next Wednesday during Holy Week at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. We invite not only the churches, the laity, and the clergy of our conference, but anyone who would like to join us. It will be a night of naming our sin, the sin that comes our way, naming the hurt and the pain that it causes, but above all, praying to the God who brings us healing, wholeness, who makes us one, who gives us love, models it for us, and enables us to be beloved community. Thank you, friends, for all that you do. Let's continue to work towards being the kind of people that God calls us to be. Beloved community, loving one another. God bless you.
Thank you, Bishop, for your greetings and your words. And we thank our Western Jurisdiction College of Bishops for their unwavering support. Let me read some excerpts from our other bishops in the Western Jurisdiction. I will post their longer statements in the chat. Bishop Robert Hoshibata, Bishop of the Desert Southwest Conference of the Western Jurisdiction of the United Methodist Church, says this: we must confront the ways that harm presents itself, whether it be innocent, retelling of jokes to perpetuating racist rhetoric related to COVID-19 or violent actions to innocent people, we must acknowledge that these are things that fuel bias and prejudice against those of Asian heritage. Also, let me read an excerpt from a statement from Bishop Elaine Stanovsky, Bishop of the greater Northwest area, including Oregon, Idaho, Pacific Northwest, and the Alaska conferences of the Western jurisdiction of the United Methodist Church. My heart overflows with love for the women who lost their lives, for elders attacked on sidewalks, for passers-by spit at. Love lives where people lay their lives down for their neighbors, not where people violate the dignity, safety, and very lives of their neighbors out of irrational fear and hatred. Again, I'll put the longer versions of those statements in the chat. You can find them there. We have a great panel of sisters and brothers poised to engage in this initial conversation. Please join me in welcoming our co-hosts for this discussion, Reverend Dr. Phil Cow, Director of Camping and Retreat Ministries and Young People's Ministry, and Reverend Michael Yoshi, retired elder, both in the California-Nevada Conference of the United Methodist Church. Join me in welcoming them as they introduce our guests.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reggie Nichols, for that introduction. I also joined this webinar as the chair of the Western Jurisdiction Asian American Coordinating Committee and the Interethnic Coordinating Committee. And I'm very delighted to introduce to you our panel of speakers in which they are doing leadership and leading their congregations in the work of anti-racism and in working, in confronting the violence against Asian and Asian Americans. And you heard Bishop Minerva mentioned earlier, the Reverend John Oda, and he is his appointment is program manager for Asian American Language Ministry of the General Board of Global Ministries. And again, thank you, John, for your leadership, especially the release of the statement against the violence occurring against Asian and Asian Americans. I'm also delighted to introduce to you an active, very active, one of the lay leaders at Buena Vista United Methodist Church, Galatea King, who is also serving as the regional organizer for the Northern California Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity. Her pastor, who is also a member of the panel, is the Reverend Myrna Bernadette Huey, appointed pastor at Buena Vista United Methodist Church in the very heart of the city of Alameda. And another panelist is the Reverend Mayna Ko, appointed pastor at Chinese Community United Methodist Church. I wanted to say at the very heart of the city of Oakland, where the population of Asian Americans are really going through this struggle that we have. And last but not the least is Henry Pablo III. He is an MDiv and MA student at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley and the leader of the Peace with Justice Ministry area of the Conference Committee on Young People's Ministry. And we're very glad because he is a representation of the voices of the young adults and the young people in our conversation this afternoon. Michael, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Phil. I want to add my welcome to all of you who've taken time to join us for today, and especially across the jurisdiction. When we first started organizing this was planning to be something for Cal Nevada, but then it expanded into a jurisdiction-wide event. And so we're aware also that all of you who are coming on to this webinar today come from very different contexts. Some of you are in Asian contexts, Asian pastors or lay members. Some of you are from, and probably most of you are probably from non-Asian congregations. So how you view this and see it comes from many different needs. Some of you may already been involved in the issue. Some of you are learning for the very first time. So we put together a panel that can give a wide spectrum of understanding of what's taking place in the situation today. If you look at my virtual background, I wanted to just invoke the presence of my grandparents on both sides of my family, because this photo was taken from the cemetery where they have been laid to rest. They are both grandparents that came to this country at the turn of the century, lived through the early years of anti-Asian sentiment, in which in 1924 there's the Anti-Asian Exclusion Act. They lived through the mass incarceration of World War II and of all the housing employment discrimination that followed that as well afterwards. And so anti-Asian sentiment is very much part of my family. I was also welcomed into a white neighborhood when my family moved there from an all-Black neighborhood at the age of 11, and was beaten up by an older boy. I was 11 years old, and this boy was 14 in the 9th grade, beat me up, pinned me down on a neighbor's corner, and punched me in the chest repeatedly and repeatedly, telling me, "Go back to China, you chink." That was my welcome to that particular neighborhood. As we convene today, for many Asians, I think what's been going on in our country is evoking memories and trauma of the past. And it's a very emotional subject for many of us in our Asian communities. And so we just want to be mindful of that for those Asians who are here today, that we want to provide a space of safety and of comfort. And for those non-Asians, just to be aware of that people will be in this space in different ways, and even in your communities. So as we engage in this conversation, to be mindful of the different ways that the issue sparks things within our hearts and souls. We want to take a moment of silence before we begin our presentations from our panelists today, particularly remembering those persons who perished in Atlanta, but also for all of those who've been unnamed and unreported over time, who've lost lives because of racism against our communities. So if I could ask us then also to take a moment of silence, invoking the presence of our ancestors as well into this space. And from this silence, we ask our God to be present with us on this day, for we know, God, that you are a God that encompasses and embraces even the painfulness of our sordid histories, but that you are a God also that is one of transforming love, that helps us to transform the wounds and pains of life into the embrace of love and compassion for others, as well as for empowerment to speak truth to power. We pray your Holy Spirit to be with us in this conversation today, so that we may bear fruits together collectively, individually, in our congregations as well. In the name and the presence of Christ Jesus, amen. We want to turn it over to John, who's going to give us kind of an overview and kind of a national picture of what's been taking place. Please welcome John Oda.
Thank you, Michael. And I want to welcome you all. There's 115 of us here, and so welcome to this webinar, and thank the Cal Nevada Conference for initiating it and opening it up to the Western jurisdiction. So my name is John Oda. I direct the Asian American Language Ministry Plan for the United Methodist Church. It's one of the 6 ethnic plans for the United Methodist Church. And the goal of the Asian American Language Ministry Plan is to really strengthen to grow and to revitalize all of the Asian American churches in the United Methodist connection in the United States. So let me start by saying the panelists were kind of shooting emails back and forth about the agenda, and someone suggested that we do this moment of silence, and I shot back kind of a pointed note that said, it's okay to do this moment of silence, but it really is the silence from the Asian American community that is literally killing us, and I am wholeheartedly, I wholeheartedly believe that. So the title of this webinar is raising our voices, addressing the hate and violence against Asian and Asian American communities, and I think that is so appropriate. My own personal experience with this is, just like Michael, I've faced the sting of racism all of my life. From as early as I can remember, there's been racist, words thrown at me. But like many Asian Americans, I basically stuffed it. When racism was thrown at me, I would say, I'm not really sure if that was racist or not. Or I would say that was racist, and I'm not going to let the person have the benefit of seeing me in anguish. On May 25th, 2020, most of you know, George Floyd was murdered by a white police officer named Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And all of us know about this incident. Many of us have seen the video. And I watched the video a number of times. Derek Chauvin had his knee on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And it's just a horrible video. The crowd is screaming out, he can't breathe. And George Floyd is screaming out for his mother. And all the while this is happening, there's an Asian police officer standing there doing nothing, there for crowd control, basically. And when I saw that video, I was really upset on a couple of levels. First of all, that George Floyd was murdered by this police officer, basically for one reason, for being a Black man in America. But the second reason why I was shocked was because of this Asian American police officer standing there. And I actually could not figure out why I was so disturbed by this. But I remember I went home and I was trying to, fall asleep that night, and I was tossing and turning. And finally, around 2 o'clock in the morning, I realized that the reason why I was upset was that police officer was a metaphor, was symbolic of the Asian American community in the United States, standing by, doing nothing most of the time, and saying, and he said this, it's not my job to get involved. So, the Asian American Language Ministry Plan right after that created this thing called the Anti-Racism Task Force. We created a statement. We have webinars every month focused on anti-Asian violence. And the title of our webinars, coincidentally, is Raise Up Your Voice Against Racism, because we believe that Asian American community historically, traditionally, are quiet about racism. Racism has been on the rise. Violence and hate has been on the rise against Asian Americans since the pandemic. The US government does not track hate crimes against Asian Americans. So therefore, back in March of 2020, Dr. Russell Jung, who's the chair of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University, started a website called Stop AAPI Hate, launched it so people can report hate crimes against Asian Americans, against themselves. And since then, 4,000 incidents have been reported. In San Francisco, the hate crimes have gone up 50% in 2020. In Philadelphia, for example, hate crimes have gone up 200%. In New York, hate crimes have gone up 833% against Asian Americans. Recently, we've seen horrendous examples of hate across the country. Older Asian Americans being pushed to the ground. One 84-year-old gentleman in San Francisco basically tackled while he was on his morning walk, and he later died. The upsetting thing about this, an additional upsetting thing about this, is that when I talk to my friends, and this is admittedly non-scientific, but when I talk to my friends, I was writing an article and I decided to poll 5 of my friends. 3 of them had racist incidents that happened to them. One of them was in a grocery store, and out of the blue, someone comes up to a white man and says, you know, go back to where you came from. She's from the born and raised in the United States. And then he said, you're the one, your people brought this virus here. So we know, it's been documented, that because of COVID-19, the pandemic, this hate is on the rise. You know, President Biden on January 26, 2021, signed a memorandum pledging to combat anti-Asian Pacific Islander discrimination. It was a wonderful memorandum, but that memorandum has not slowed down the incidents of hate. The incidents of hate continue to grow. On March 15th, the Asian American Language Ministry Plan issued yet another statement condemning anti-Asian violence in the country. And this time we had all of the active bishops endorse it. We had a lot of the Asian American in academia endorse it. Asian American United Methodist leaders endorsed it. And it was published on March 15th. On March 16th, we all know 8 people were senselessly murdered in Atlanta. 6 were Asian American women. And the authorities have yet to say whether these shootings were hate crimes, but I know in my heart that these slayings are a part of the ongoing and growing pattern of violence against Asian Americans. Let me just close by saying, you know, during World War II, I'm of Japanese American descent. So during World War II, all of my grandparents, my aunts and uncles, my mother and father were illegally incarcerated in American concentration camps. And their crime was that they were of Japanese ancestry. Now, years later, a study was done and it asked a simple question, like, how could this happen? I mean, how could this atrocious event happen pretty much in front of the entire United States? And no one really, for the most part, did nothing. So they came up with 3 reasons why this happened. First, they said it was wartime hysteria. They said that the Americans feared that the Japanese Americans would hurt them. Secondly, they said that there was a hatred at that time toward Japanese Americans. And lastly, they said there was a lack of political leadership within the Japanese American community and certainly from the US government. And I would say those same elements are partially at work in the United States right now. There is a powerful hatred against Asian Americans. At least a portion of our society has this hatred toward Asian Americans. I believe there's a heightened sense of fear, almost a hysteria against Asian Americans because of the uncertainties surrounding COVID-19. Lastly, I think there's a lack of political leadership within the Asian American community. And I would attribute that lack of political leadership to the majority of Asian Americans' desire to remain silent around this. Asian Americans have not organized that well on a national level. And I hope this will be changing soon. There was just an article that someone sent me about this huge rally in New York. But we haven't raised our voices against racism, against this anti-Asian violence to our elected officials or in public venues in mass. And when racism happens to us, for the most part, many of us just stuff it and we pretend it doesn't affect us. So this needs to change. And so things like this webinar are a good start. I would say that we can't do it alone. We need allies. We need to join hands with our African American and Latinx brothers and sisters in this important work. So thank you.
Thank you, John. I want to thank John for his leadership nationally with this. And one of the things you can do, everyone can take the Asian American Language Ministry statement, bring it back to your congregations, let them know what they have stated as Asian American leaders, and also join John's webinars that are, I think, monthly, right, John? And I've attended several of them. They've been very well done, very instructive. We want to turn next to Gayla King, who's going to share with us some things around the nature of systemic racism and also some of the historical backdrop of the anti-Asian violence we're seeing today. Gayla?
Thank you, Pastor Michael. It's really good to be with you all. And I have to start by just taking a really deep breath. As everyone has shared so far, this is a really challenging topic for many of us who don't, as Asian Americans, and for me as Filipino Americans, to share what we've experienced, to share what our communities have experienced. And I agree, John, that part of this is breaking our silence around what we've experienced and the trauma we've experienced. So I'm going to share my reflections, but first grounding in who I am as a Filipino American. And we know Asian American Pacific Islander is such an incredibly diverse group, right? We somehow are all lumped together, even though we represent dozens of cultures and languages and experiences. So I think it's important we name who are our people, right? And who are we connected to and representing? So my mom, who's also on this webinar, was born in the Philippines during World War II. So at the time when Japanese Americans were being incarcerated on this land, my mom was born during the time that the US was bombing the Philippines because Japan was occupying the Philippines. And she grew up in the Philippines as a colony of the United States and eventually immigrated to Minnesota in the 60s, where I grew up in a very white suburb of Minneapolis, where, like you've heard the other speakers, experienced my own experiences of xenophobic slurs and racial slurs, to go back to a country that, I was born there. I was born in the United States. But I also had a very vibrant, tight-knit Filipino immigrant, Filipino American community in Minnesota that held space for my family to be a source of strength and a source of pride, which many of us continue to hold today. So some of my earliest memories of anti-Asian violence, and has been surfacing for me with what the tragedy of Atlanta, is when I was in college, I learned about the US militarization in the Philippines. And I was blessed to hear the stories of many women living near the bases, some of them working in the restaurant and hospitality industry, some of them working in the sex industry for survival, some of them just living, but all of them subject to the exploitation of the US military men in their hometowns. And one story I will never forget was that of a young Filipina named Nicole, who was out on the town with her friends, met some US military men, and was brutally raped. We met Nicole as she was seeking accountability from our US government. So Nicole's story is not alone. The hypersexualization of Asian women is not new. Gender-based violence is something Asian women know a lot about. And it's perpetuated by our history of US imperialism and colonialism abroad and in our media. So when we think of what's happened in Atlanta, we have to see how the deaths of the 6 women of Chinese and Korean ancestry are a part of this trajectory, regardless of what the authorities down there say. As Filipinos and as many of our communities, we've been a part of this United States, occupied United States tapestry for centuries, right? Our migration stories are woven here. The first Filipino, many of you hopefully know, arrived in California in 1587 in Morro Bay. In the 1700s, we came to the bayous of Louisiana. In the 1900s, we were farm workers, cannery workers, all up and down the West Coast and in Hawaii. In World War II, Filipinos fought alongside Americans, right? Veteranos who are still seeking some kind of acknowledgement. And in the 60s, we came as students, as doctors, as nurses, and like my mom. So our histories and our experiences are so much a part of this country, but they're not spoken about. I didn't learn about any of this growing up in Minnesota. Our existence sometimes feel like it's being erased. And throughout our time here, we've also experienced anti-Asian violence, which we've been hearing about today. This is not new to our people. It didn't just appear with the past president, although his rhetoric has really increased the visibility of it. The anti-Asian violence we experience is rooted in our long history of US colonialism and the wars that we wage abroad. And it's taken different forms. For Filipinos in the 1900s, we were perceived as stealing jobs and white women, so we were met with angry mobs, the Watsonville riots, which finally got recognized this past summer. Over time, the violence has looked like inhumane immigration policies and practices, which have led to now 300,000 Filipinos living undocumented, living in the shadows, decades of family separation, exploitation of low-wage workers. This violence looks like a rogue ICE agency that is arresting, detaining, and deporting people. Last week, we deported 33 Vietnamese refugees, many of whom have lived here their entire lives and didn't set foot in Vietnam until we deported them. The violence looks like our mass incarceration system that disproportionately locks up Black and brown bodies. Filipinos are the most represented in incarcerated system among Asian American Pacific Islanders. And the violence looks like the death of Angelo Quinto, a Filipino American in Antioch who was having a mental health crisis and was killed ultimately by the police. And today we see what this violence is looking like, as John has described, even more driven by the xenophobia and the rhetoric under the past administration. So I'll end with just sharing some thoughts on how do we respond to this violence. And I hesitate to go there in the sense that I feel like I'm still grieving and processing, as we all are, but I do want us, I hope that when we're ready to really respond more, centering the needs of the victims and the survivors is first and foremost. And I know there's a lot of efforts to bring resources to Atlanta, Georgia. So I encourage we continue to do that. And I also encourage us to think about our response in a way that's systemic, in a way that's looking at the long term, and in a way that's intersectional. So this means we have to center the voices of our community that's at the margins, our elders, our women, trans folks, low-wage workers, particularly those in industries that are often criminalized, like the sex industry and the massage industry. We need to center the voices of the undocumented and our community members returning home from incarceration. Our movements need to be as committed to anti-Asian racism as we are to anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism. And our solutions should have restorative justice practices and approaches that don't necessarily lead to more policing, because more policing harms many of our communities, particularly those that are in the margins. I think the faith community has such an incredibly unique role to play. As we've heard, the incredible statements that are coming out, the faith community providing spaces for prayer, for healing, for ritual. And I also would love to see more of us in the faith community be at the city council meetings, be at the table when they're talking about where do we reinvest our resources, that we need to speak out from and represent, the faith voice and our faith values. So with that, I just want to thank you all for being a part of this conversation.
Thank you, Gayla, and thank you for your work and bringing that historical and systemic perspective to this conversation, and also for the call for interethnic solidarity in all that we do. Our next two speakers are going to provide a perspective from the local church ministries and responses that are already taking place there, and I want to turn it over to Reverend Myrna Bernadette-Huey, who is the pastor at Buena Vista United Methodist Church.
Thank you, Michael. I'm in my first year at the Buena Vista United Methodist Church, located in Alameda, California. The Buena Vista United Methodist Church, I think, should probably be called the Buena Vista Avenue United Methodist Church, because oftentimes when you hear that name, it might not occur to most folks who hear it to know that it is a historically Japanese American congregation that has been in Alameda in one way or another for since the 1800s. The community, the Japanese American community in Alameda, was a thriving community up until the incarceration and being taken away during World War II. That community was the first in the West to be incarcerated and taken away with the executive order because of the naval base that was located there on Alameda. I also learned just within the last few hours, actually, because there is a Japanese American history project that's happening to document the history of this community in Alameda. I learned that the Buena Vista Church was actually, it was called the Japanese American Methodist Episcopal Church South at one point in its history. I say that to say that we see that the arm of racism is so embedded into the life of our denomination. About a month ago, we had the recognition of the Day of Remembrance, and some of you in the Western jurisdiction participated, may have participated in that service. And one of the things that has impressed me is that out of that experience, there has been an empathy and a connection with the movement for Black lives, the call for reparations from African Americans, and that voice. So last fall, the congregation held a 5-month series on racial justice and solidarity with the movement for Black lives. And it was, and I know from the names I've seen in the chat that some of you were a part of that series. And we looked at the history of militarism, racism, and poverty. We looked at white supremacy and racism. We looked at the model minority myth and anti-Black sentiment. We looked at healing from racial trauma. And the stories were deep and they were personal and had a sense that people were really coming to terms and really putting the pieces together around racialized violence. And yet, with all of that awareness, when the news came out of what happened outside of Atlanta last Tuesday, people were thrown off center. It left me speechless, and I found that the most important thing for me to do was to begin by listening, and listening to the voices of my Asian friends, members of the congregation. My husband happens to be Chinese American and part of a group that brings me into that community, and listening And I heard that how racialized violence landed on them, and especially the women, was how racialized violence, when I've heard of it and experienced it, has landed on me. The language is nearly identical. How did we respond? What has been our own congregational response? Well, actually, last Sunday I took a page from our annual conference when we had a conversation focused around the question of when was the first time that you felt different? So in worship, we broke into breakout groups and had small group conversations around that question and made space to hear one another, to listen, to speak. And we're going to continue that conversation later this week. So I'm finding that making space, listening is really important in this moment, especially as we've heard for a community that may not be accustomed to raising its voice, making that space for people to speak. Locally, what we've also just, everything is kind of coming together. Even this week in Alameda, there will be a two-part vigil starting online for those who are feeling a bit protective during this time of pandemic. And with Michael, Yoshi, and I will be participating in that, as well as then a part 2 that's going to be a public candlelight vigil for people who want to come together and lift up the names and have ritual and have prayer and have just an acknowledgement of the pain that the Asian community, Asian American community is experiencing at this time. I was asked to speak for about 10 minutes, and I'm going to stop now and pass the ball to my colleague who will speak about the response in her community. I just basically encourage listening at this time.
Just want to pause there as well. As Myrna had mentioned, we're both in Alameda and we're having a vigil this coming week. Probably in many of your communities, people are organizing vigils, rallies, and what have you. But we're really supporting youth in the community that are really coming together to speak up. And I think it's significant that they'll hold the vigil at a place called Chochenyo Park, which was recently renamed from Andrew Jackson Park. And there was quite a bit of community conversation about what Andrew Jackson represented in terms of the Trail of Tears and his anti-people of color attitudes. And also in Alameda, there was a school that was named Henry Haight School that was renamed a couple of years ago because Henry Haight was very anti-racist, very anti-Asian, and he ran for governor on that platform, which led to the 1882 Anti-Chinese Exclusion Act. So these kinds of things around name changes are also significant community education points and opportunities for solidarity building. Our next speaker,
The hate school was renamed Love School.
Love School, absolutely. Yeah. So our next speaker comes from Oakland, Chinatown, and serving the Oakland Chinese community, UMC there, and has been right in the middle of a lot of what has been taking place in our conference, particularly with the concentration of Chinese businesses and residents there. So please welcome Reverend Mina Ko.
It's good to be with you, brothers and sisters. My name is Mina Ko, and I'm the first generation immigrant from Taiwan. And yeah, I'm the pastor right now serving at Chinese Community UMC. We are all aware that discrimination and hatred toward the Asian and Asian American communities predates the coronavirus pandemic. Unfortunately, the recent news about 2 old men, one 84 years old in San Francisco, another one 91-year-old in Oakland, Chinatown, violently pushed down to the ground, and also the mass shooting in Atlanta, killing 8 people, and 6 of them were Asian women. we just realized the hate crimes have just become more shocking and heinous. And ever since last spring, when the pandemic erupted, be it racist or random in root, there has been a clear uptick in anti-Asian violence. Fear, bias toward those who are different, and xenophobia are real and serious. There is a shared perspective within the Oakland Chinatown community, from businesses, community organizations, and residents, that there has been a rise in anti-China sentiment over the last 10 to 20 years here in the United States, and that the trade wars with China during the last few years have stirred the pot even more. The pandemic seems to open the door between political rhetoric to verbal and physical attacks on individuals, with the inflammatory rhetoric of Trump administration blaming China for the pandemic and calling the COVID-19, the China virus, a source of danger. The impact of all of this was not experienced only by the Chinese or Chinese American communities, but splashed out onto the whole Asian American Pacific Islanders community. Regrettably, the new wave of Asian violence spread so quickly and thoroughly that even elementary students were unable to escape the impact. The 7-year-old granddaughter of my congregant was deeply hurt by words that came from a good friend. In front of the whole class on Zoom, this classmate said, "I don't like China or Chinese people because they started this quarantine." Fortunately, her mother worked with her to write down and then express what she felt in response. She wrote down this: "When we did the Zoom meeting, someone said that he doesn't like China and Chinese people. This made me feel sad because I'm Chinese. I hope you will stop telling people that, because it's mean and wrong. It's wrong because he doesn't know what he's saying. No one knows how the virus started for sure. When you say you don't like Chinese people, you are saying you do not like me. I did not start this virus. But thank you for being my friend." We can learn much from this little girl. She was clear and firm, respectful and open. This congregant took this lived experience and created teaching material from it for the 30 students of our after-school program. She wrote a skit and then created a short film to show to our students. Our hope was to first create awareness of what was happening, to provide space to talk about it. And secondly, support them in responding to what was happening in healthy and hopeful ways. We at Chinese Community UMC feel heartbroken, angry, and anxious about the anti-Asian discrimination and attacks that have been happening. But as a church, as Christ's body, we also deeply feel an unavoidable call towards bringing reconciliation in the midst of the broken relationships of our world. We seek to scatter the seed of reconciliation, hope, and faith in the children's heart. As George Floyd's murder brought about a renewed call for the Black Lives Matter movement, CCUMC supported the cause against systemic racism and police brutality. We held a series of talks on racial justice led by our former associate pastor, D.K. Ken Shun. The talks deepened our awareness of racism and systemic racism and helped us put our own experiences into a much larger context. Through listening, learning, mutual sharing, lamenting, and praying, we witnessed one another's struggle, pain, and challenges. We understand that the white supremacy does not only impact the Black community, but impacts the AAPI community too. And that it has caused a wedge between the Black and the AAPI community. We were able to see the many wounds between communities that needs healing, and our great need for God's light and transformation to bring about a more just and equitable society. At the present moment, the residents and community of Oakland Chinatown, our church community included, do not feel safe. They do not feel safe to leave their homes, to take walks around the neighborhood, to exercise outdoors, to catch some fresh air. Many have reduced their outing to the bare essentials, picking up just the medicines or buy groceries. People avoid carrying handbags or purses when doing shopping. And the extended community is hesitant, even unwilling to visit friends and family in Chinatown. Oakland Chinatown had experienced a decline in the recent years, and these recent events feel doubly hurtful. Many of the organizations within Chinatown have been working together, organizing foot patrolling teams, encouraging the community to band together, protecting one another, to keep the Chinatown vibrant. With them, CCUMC affirms that community safety starts with us. We move together. We also looking forward to being a part of a community initiative called Healing Circles for Change, supported by Tuzu for Solidarity, a Japanese-American organization. We know that the work of healing, especially for our elders, will persist beyond the time the media cameras are on the current issue, the stories. At the moment, more and more people are carrying personal protective gear to leave the house. Whistles, pepper spray, safety alarms, etc. But these can only cure the symptoms, not the root causes. The root causes of violences are many, including poverty, mental health issues, and racism, and etc. And these are all openings for the church to be at work with the community, working to bring Christ's love and healing to the brokenness. And in fact, it's Christ's love and healing that is incarnational light in a dark world. Finally, I believe we must encourage the AAPI community to stand up and give voice to the violence and discrimination we have experienced. Our community has typically been thought of as quiet due to cultural and language barriers, especially amongst us, our elders. We have been taught that politics is corrupt and that we should not get involved. This teaching has led to the narrowing of our vision and concern, where we seek to take care of only ourselves. This has meant that we haven't gotten to know the experiences nor struggles of other communities. Thus, Asian Americans have become known as the model minority. But this has left us in a weakened position. Many in the community look passive or indifferent to the issue of racism because they think we are minority. We are powerless. And yet, solidarity is the best strategy we can take right now, because when we and other minorities are together, we are stronger. We must open ourselves, our hearts, our acceptance, our care to other communities, to join together to raise our voices against injustice and discrimination. And this is precisely the time we must be awakened by the word of Reverend Martin Niemöller, a German pastor, in his poem, First Lay Camp. For a while, we have our own differences. We are created. We are all created by God and belong in God's beloved community. We are called to stand with and to be neighbors to one another. I will close my sharing with this poem, First Lay Camp. First Lay Camp for the socialist, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionist, but I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor Mena, and also Pastor Myrna for your leadership in your congregations. And as Bishop Carcano said, we should all be in prayer for one another, but particularly for pastors who are serving in these very emotion-laden contexts. So we are with you in your leadership in your respective congregations. And we want to encourage also more conversation among congregational leaders, pastors, lay leaders to share ministry applications on what's taking place in the bigger picture. Before we go to our next speaker, I just want to remind us that if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A box, and we'll be going to Q&A right after our last speaker, who is Henry Pablo, and bringing a perspective from young adults. Henry is actually an MDiv student in his last year at the Pacific School of Religion and in the process of ordination, and we look to celebrate his ordination this coming year in the California-Nevada Annual Conference. Henry, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you for everyone who has shared so far, and just acknowledging that this space for the panelists is not just a space to give information, but is also a healing space for the panelists as well. And so as Pastor Michael, Pastor Yoshi, I'm on the ordained elder track for the United Methodist Church, but I'm also currently serving as an English ministry coordinator at Riverside United Methodist Church in Sacramento, which is a majority Chinese American community. And I'm also a member, as Pastor Fellis said, a member of the California-Nevada Conference Committee on Young People's Ministries. And so for me, I'm engaging the rise of anti-AAPI sentiment from the perspective of a youth and young adult leader that serves in a pastoral to a majority Chinese American community, a young adult navigating intergenerational dynamics within and outside of the church, and as a Filipino American within various Filipino American communities. And I would once again like to thank Dr. Nichols and the program staff for giving me an opportunity to share my thoughts. Within the California-Nevada's Conference Committee on Young People's Ministries is a newly created ministry team area titled the Peace with Justice Team. The mission of the team is to amplify the voices of young people within the conference that are interested in or are already engaging in social justice work through creating connections and providing them with resources. Another part of the mission is to create a space for theological reflection on the intersection between faith and social justice. And so the Peace with Justice team right now is currently working on co-creating a space for young people within the conference to come together and engage in a conversation around the rise of anti-AAPI sentiment and in all its intersections. And during the planning process this past week, a member made an important statement that resonated with me. They stated, "The church can't be naive in thinking that young people are not doing anything. The church can't be naive in thinking that young people are not doing anything." And in the circles of young people that I am a part of within the conference, there are youth and young adults who are already organizing around the rise of anti-AAPI sentiment and other justice issues. There are young people that are already engaging in organizing work within their schools and communities that they live in. There are young people marching in the streets, engaging in gatherings for community healing, teaching others how to dismantle racism, speaking at their community council meetings, sharing resources and amplifying the voices of others through social media, and engaging in other forms of justice work like art and poetry. And some of these young people may be attending or are even members in the churches that you serve. And even if they are not organizing, they know what's going on. They know that a Filipino-American young adult, Angela Quinto, died due to police brutality. They know that Vietnamese refugees are being deported. They know that Asian Americans are struggling with mental health. They know that 8 people were murdered in Atlanta and that 6 of the victims were of Asian descent and that 7 of them were women. And they too, the AAPI young people in our churches, may have also experienced discrimination. 1 in 4 Asian American youth experience racist bullying. The dissonance and tension occurs when young people go to church on Sunday or attend their youth group, and the church leaders either don't speak up about the injustices they see and experience, they don't create safe and brave spaces for them to talk about how these injustices are affecting them, and don't check in with them during these times of crisis. In an infographic about how parents can talk to their children about racism, it states, adolescents receiving fewer messages about race and ethnicity from parents are most at risk for psychological distress if they have experienced discrimination. Church leaders that are silent on situations of injustice may indeed be perpetuating harm, especially against the Asian American young people during this time. And I wonder if this is maybe one of the reasons why young people are leaving the church. I hear this question all the time from church leaders in the spaces that I inhabit. Why are young people leaving the church? I believe this is an important question to ask, but I want to make sure to nuance it and be mindful that young people leaving the church is not equivalent to young people leaving the faith. Young people leaving the church is not equivalent to young people leaving the faith. And so in my experience, young people are finding and creating alternative spaces of spiritual nourishment, of getting closer to God and cultivating their faith, outside the United Methodist Church. Although you may not see young people during the Sunday service, or you might not even see a bunch of young people here right now in this webinar, they are out there ushering the kingdom of God and getting closer to Jesus. And so the question is, where does that leave us? Where does it leave me as I too hopefully will be appointed to a local church come July? I think first, we really need to be engaging in pastoral care. Even if you don't mention it in the pulpit or draft a statement in solidarity, we need to be checking in with our young people and workers with young people in times of crisis. However, I would also like to add, there are young people that are yearning for injustice to be called out in the pulpit and become jaded when they are greeted with silence. The least we can do is provide pastoral care, and we don't need to provide answers. We just need to listen. Second, we need to create spaces for young people to engage in safe and brave conversations. These spaces may have a goal of healing, brainstorming, mobilizing, and also talking about their faith. There are young people that are yearning church leaders to help them articulate about the connection between faith and justice. Third, we need to affirm and illuminate and celebrate the work that young people are doing outside of the church. Like I said earlier, there are young people within the church that are already organizing. And these spaces that they are engaging in outside of the church can be just as spiritually forming as this church Sunday service and other ministries. And in affirming and illuminating their work, we need to empower young people to serve at all levels of the church. But consequently, we also need to be mindful that their work is not tokenized and co-opted. Instead, we are making sure that clergy and older folk are listening and learning, amplifying the voices of young people and letting them lead. And so when it comes to the rise of anti-AAPI sentiment, the young people are already at work. And so as parents, clergy, and church leaders, we need to support them and provide pastoral care, create spaces of conversation within the church, and affirm the work that they're already doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you for the work you're doing with the young people and the leadership you're providing for them, as well as the insights you're giving to the church as a whole. Just another reminder that if you have questions, you can put it in the Q&A box. And I think there was a request for all the panelists, if you can share the context of your ministry in the chat box, and also maybe contact information for people to be in touch with you directly if they need to. So while we're waiting for questions and answers to come up, we're going to turn it back to Fel. As Bishop Carcano mentioned, there are some things already brewing in the Cal Nevada conference that she wanted us to share with our viewers today.
Yes, thank you, Michael. Bishop Carcano issued or released a statement on Sunday, and with this statement includes action steps, and thank you, John, Gayla, Mena, and Myrna, of course, and Henry, with the actions that you're already doing in your respective setting of ministries. And so here are the action steps from our Bishop Minerva Carcano of the California Nevada Conference. Declare publicly that you stand with the Asian American community. Put it on your church's signboard, in your bulletins, newsletters, letters to the editor of your local newspaper. Secondly, reach out to our Asian American neighbors and extending support to them. Put on your mask and go and knock on the door of your neighbor and say you wanted to make sure that they were safe. Offer to accompany Asian American elderly and women on the streets of our communities and say to them, I am concerned about your safety. May I walk with you? So for those of you who are already asking what can be done, what could we do together? So these are very bold and prophetic action steps that Bishop Carcano is sharing with us. Engage with Asian American community organizations to learn what you and I can do to express our solidarity. Call the organizations and say you want to know how to be supportive of the Asian American communities and invite them to speak to a Zoom gathering of your church. And then, of course, pray without ceasing for Asian American families at every worship service, every meeting, as we arise in the morning, as we end our day, with special care to teach our children to pray with us. Like, for example, this evening, there will be a prayer meeting at 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time that our conference lay leader, Michelle Pope, is leading with the young people. If you want to attend that prayer meeting, and I can put that in the chat as well, the link, please do so as we continue to strengthen one another in solidarity through prayers. Michael?
We'll now go to Q&A. We did have a question that was left in the question box asking how do we deal with the trauma of ethnocentrism as well as the issues of anti-Asian sentiment. Any panelists like to respond to that? How do we address our ethnocentrism within Asian communities?
Is the question about the disaggregation within the Asian community, or is this question about other ethnic groups? It's not clear to me.
I believe it's about the insular nature that many of Asian communities can have, you know, that people keep to themselves and stay within their own. John, you're nodding. Do you want to say something?
This is such a great question. And, you know, when I've talked to people about ethnocentrism within the Asian American community, Asian community, we go back to this really dominant culture idea that there is a thing called Asia, when in fact, it's just a geographic area. And within Asia, there are 48 different countries and I don't know how many different languages. And so, you know, of course, well, I shouldn't say of course, there is obvious castes, prejudices, belief that one culture is better than the other. And now the question is, how do you deal with it? I think it's the same way that we deal with our racism, our prejudice interculturally. So I've also had conversations with Asian Americans about their prejudice against other communities of color. And the way to resolve that, way to get over those is to have a conversation, to be in dialogue. It's a sticky issue. One of the issues that has come up again and again is the idea of skin color within different races. And I don't know if this is true. This is just my own experience, but there's a lot of Asian cultures that will say that the lighter the skin, the better the person, or the more intelligent, or whatever. And in a lot of Asian cultures, this seems to be true. Anyway, yeah.
I'd like to add a little something to that, John. The very last piece, I mentioned that 5-part series that the roundtable conversations that we had at Buena Vista in the fall. And one of our coordinator of spiritual nurture, Coke Tani, when she spoke about her experience, she ended up speaking about within the Asian context, light supremacy, as opposed to necessarily white supremacy, but really reaffirming that, yeah, and this, I think that light supremacy has its roots, of course, in white supremacy, because this happens as well, we know, within the Black community of the shade is a part of that. So the beast is white supremacy in that myth. That is the beast.
Thank you both. Another, it's sort of related question. How can we affirm the group and not see Asian Americans as a monolith? And we're mindful even today that there are different voices from different Asian communities, but there are many Asian communities not represented in this panel today. And this was just meant to be a first conversation. But does anyone want to share your thoughts on that question? How can we affirm the group and yet not see Asian Americans as a monolith? Kayla, you're nodding. I'm going to call on you.
I think our comments today have sort of modeled the need, right, for us to be sharing when we do speak, to not try to speak for the entire group of AAPI, but really grounding ourselves in our own personal experience. I think is really important. And I do think the more that we can share how we personally and how our community are impacted by what's happening now, as well as what's happened historically, I think is really important, because I also think so much education is needed within our communities, but as well as to the broader, to other communities as well. So I think it's a both and. I think it's holding space for us to be very specific, and then also seeing how we're impacted as a whole.
Okay, thank you, Gayla. Does want to comment on that? If not, I'm seeing a question. I'm losing it now. About bringing together AAPI faith communities across faiths, traditions, and denominations. Oh no, that's an announcement. The question, I think, is bringing together UMC, all the caucuses together for unity versus segregation. How do we break the barriers that we create? John, I know as one working in a national scope with the ALM, you probably have been in conversations about that.
Yeah, and so this is an interesting question as well. Currently, there's the ethnic plans and there's the ethnic caucuses. The ethnic plans were created by the vote of General Conference and funded by the General Conference. The ethnic caucuses have no funding. And historically, the ethnic caucuses have been the advocacy arm for the various ethnic groups. And I would say historically, más o menos, more or less, the caucuses have operated separately and the ethnic plans have operated somewhat separately. So there's been a move because there's a lot of funding in jeopardy for all of the ethnic caucuses and all of the ethnic plans to come together as one and have one voice. So we are coming together, but there also is, I think, importance in staying separate in our work, because there's so much difference, there's so much history, there's so many nuances in every one of the caucuses, and within each caucus there's different nuances of how to work with your different communities. I work with 12 different Asian caucuses, and we just had a webinar last night on the model minority myth, the dangers of. And if you look at the Asian American community, they have actually become the #1 ethnic group, surpassing the African Americans as the most divided financially in equity. So within the Asian groups, there are some very rich people and some very poor people. When you talk about the Bhutanese community, about 30% of the Bhutanese community in the United States are living below the poverty line. So we can come together, but we also have to realize that we're very, very, very different.
John, I think there was a question asking what are the different ethnic caucuses. I think that was meant for the Asian subgroups. So could you actually name them?
Okay, yeah, this is a test. How well do you know your job, John?
Yeah.
All right, there's 12. There's the Chinese, Cambodian, and I think Wathanak is on the call, so you can help me. Vietnamese, Filipino, Middle Eastern, Pakistani, Formosan Taiwanese, Lao Thai, Japanese. I'm forgetting 3.
I may add South Asian.
Korean. Oh yeah, Indian, Korean, and there's one more. So anyway, yeah, very, very different. When when we have a meeting, it's very interesting. There are some, for example, there are some cultures where it's fine to get into someone's face and argue and disagree And there's other Asian cultures where that is not kosher, you know, so they'll sit back. So my job as a facilitator at some of these meetings is to make sure we hear voices from every one of those ethnic caucuses.
Greg
Anyway.
Vang is saying, don't forget the Hmongs.
Oh, sorry, Greg.
And
Yes,
also,
Hmong.
I think the question actually was the ethnic plans nationally, not the sub-ethnic caucuses. I'm
Oh, sorry. Yes. So there are 6 ethnic plans. Asian American Language Ministry Plan, the Native American Ministry Plan, the Hispanic Latino Ministry Plan, the Pacific Islander Ministry Plan, the Korean Ministry Plan, and something called Strengthening the Black Church for the 21st Century, which is the African American Ministry Plan. So the Koreans have their own plan because they're so large, and they get pretty good funding too. They do great work. And let me just say, the Hmong community is very, very strong and very well organized. So I'm sorry that I left them off the list.
Okay. Here's an important question. How can we create opportunities between our diverse groups to build relationships and strengthen unity, particularly between African Americans and Asian Americans? I think, Mena, you are working on that, and Myrna as well. You want to share the models and thoughts about how others can replicate?
Yes and no. I am looking at the fact that we were told we had a hard stop at 5:30 and we've got 4 minutes. So I'm just kind of mindful of time. Education is how we started at Buena Vista. Just fundamentally in terms of overcoming our own biases, that the work begins personally. And it is important for leaders to also speak out. I think Henry pointed that out in his comments, to understand where this idea of the wedge that the model minority myth creates between, it's an intentional placement of Asians as model to place a wedge between the Black and Asian communities, to understand those dynamics. So a lot of it really, from my perspective, is really about education and working across boundaries with each other. It's a commitment.
Thanks. Mena?
Yeah, I would think the conversation or dialogue between African American or Asian American, it's very important, but not easy. We need to create that safe space, you know, for both groups to share, and for there's a very complicated feeling that we said that there's a wedge between these two groups, and we need to create that space so that people are comfortable to share. But you know, there should be a first step for this ministry. You know, this to me is also a ministry of reconciliation, even between people of faith. You know, that's a beginning, that very important step to take.
Henry, you want to share what you're doing with the young people? I think you're modeling that with how you're working interethnically.
Yeah, I guess my role right now is just reaching out to the young people of the conference and seeing what they're doing. And I'd also just like to advertise it as well too. Like if you have young people that are engaging in organizing work, to, you know, talk with them, to listen to them, and also possibly connect them to the Peace with Justice team. And that's what we're hoping to do soon, especially on this topic of anti-API sentiment. And we're planning hopefully for a gathering of young people on April 6th to not necessarily do what we did here, but more of a space for them to heal and voice their opinions, but also ask them, what do you need the church to do? And bring it back to you all to see, you know, what needs to be done. Because like I said before, they're already out there. They're doing stuff outside of the church that are bridging ethnic communities together. They're rooting it and making sure that they don't perpetuate anti-Blackness. They're doing the learning, they're doing the work. I think maybe just asking them like, hey, what can we do as pastors? What can we do as leaders to amplify your voices during this time.
Okay, thank you. And thank you all panelists and all folks who've joined in today. I want to turn it back to Reggie. We do have a hard stop at 5:30 and share a last word from Reggie. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Michael and Fel and all of our panelists. What a great discussion. But we said this was the initial conversation. So we hope and pray that you'll continue in the conversations. I put a link in the chat. There will be a prayer webinar next Wednesday. Please join us. You can go to cnumc.org and look at our events calendar or our webinar calendar. There should be links, Zoom links for that time. It's a time where we can get together and pray and be with each other. So I want to thank all the panelists and thank you for attending this vitally important time and conversation. Again, this is the initial conversation. We knew we could not wrap everything up in 45 minutes or 60 minutes or 90 minutes. We know it's going to take our lifetimes to continue to raise our voices and stand up for justice. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. As I mentioned, this is our last branded Wednesday webinar. We will have other webinars throughout the annual throughout our conference. You'll be able to find them on the California, Nevada website. We thank our sisters and brothers from the Western jurisdiction, and we thank our siblings from around the region and around the area. Join us as we raise our voices to stamp out this violence and this hatred in our Asian American communities. Thank you. Have a good night. Bye-bye now.